I think it's the right time to start. So I'm chairing this session. Right? Usually Marie will chair IPPE sessions, but from now on, we try to chair our own. Right? But be careful, right? Because when we're in charge, we'll be picky. Marie has been so kind so far.
Don't worry,
So it's a pre-submission presentation by James Donald, and we'll expect you to give a roughly 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have a lot of discussion, and then within 1 hour this will be complete. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much, and thanks a lot for coming along today. I will be speaking fairly quickly because it's hard to fit, 3+ years work into sort of 30 minutes. So please bear with me if some of it seems a bit kind of rushed. So my PhD topic is looking at how people cope with stress, not how stress makes you feel, but the kind of responses that people engage with in the context of stressful situations, and whether mindfulness influences that in some way. And I've looked at that across 4 different studies using a few different methods for doing this. So the way I think about stress and stressful situations is a bit like a fire. When there's a fire, it's like all your attention goes there. A big meeting that you're preparing for, or a deadline, or a difficult conversation that you've got to have with someone. It occupies all your attention. And coping really is about the ways that we manage the demands of these kind of fires as they show up in our lives. One of the most common ways of looking at this is the basic distinction between wanting to avoid this stressful situation, whatever it might be, and seeking to engage with it in some way. And this basic, for example, in the case of a fire, you just want to get away from it, you hope someone else will put it out, or that it'll die out by itself, or it'll just sort of disappear, which it generally doesn't, of course, versus looking to try and get help putting it out or engaging with it directly yourself. So this is essentially what my thesis is focused on. More formally, coping, as I've said, really all about the ways that people seek to manage the demands of stressful situations. So it's quite a broad construct. It's a massive literature. Over 30,000 studies over the last 4 decades have explored how people cope with stress. But as I say, one common way of thinking about coping is this simple distinction between avoidance and approach. And this is what I've used in my thesis in 3 of my 4 studies. And I've just got in bullet points there some of the different ways that both approach and avoidance are operationalised in the literature. These come from the coping inventory of Charles Carver, and I've used this in 3 of my 4 studies. It just gives you a flavour of kind of what we're talking about and how we're measuring coping responses. Mindfulness is obviously in the popular media a lot at the moment. There's been a lot of research into mindfulness, and the reason I'm showing this image is because most of the research into mindfulness focuses on how it makes you feel better, how it makes you maybe even look like this, who knows, but it makes you feel less stressed, less anxious, more calm and more peaceful. And of course that's an important idea, an important part of what mindfulness does. Theories of mindfulness emphasise this, how it enhances our affect, which is the bottom bubble. But a lot less research has looked at how it can help us to regulate our behaviour better. And that's really what my research is focused on. And that's really what coping is about, what you think about. It's regulating your behaviour in the context of a stressful event. And just cited some of the main theorising around this. That's really where my research fits into the broader mindfulness research agenda. So, as I said, the mindfulness research is broad and deep, but the research into mindfulness, the coping literature is broad and deep, but the research into mindfulness and whether and how and when mindfulness might enhance how people cope with stress is much more shallow and immature. And I've essentially in my thesis kind of problematized different aspects of this literature and formed 3 main research questions that I attempt to try and address. The first one is quite basic. Simply, does mindfulness enhance how people cope with stress? Several of the studies that have looked at this and attempted to manipulate mindfulness have been with relatively small samples, so statistical power has been an issue, and as I say, it's a fairly immature literature. So the first aim of my thesis is basically just to turn the crank on the science in this space a bit further and see what shows up. Secondly, an unanswered question from the literature is essentially the possibility that perceived stress might be an important moderator of the effects of mindfulness on how people cope with stress. And this has been suggested in the literature but not actually tested empirically, and so this was kind of the second focus of my research. And my first 3 studies, as you can see there, have focused on these 2 questions. And then a third kind of well, I should briefly just mention that the reason the second question is important is because it may be that in relatively unstressful situations, mindfulness doesn't really matter. You know, you're coping just fine. It's only when you're relatively stressed does mindfulness make a difference to how you're actually behaving. The third question that we explored in studies 3 and 4 was delving a little bit deeper into particular components of mindfulness that we thought, based on a literature review, should have a particular impact on how people cope with stress. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail when I get to it. So studies 1 and 2 look to manipulate mindfulness, and I've just put this up here to address a definition of mindfulness. This is probably one that most people are familiar with. It's probably the most commonly cited. Studies 1 and 2, we attempted to manipulate mindfulness as a kind of unitary phenomenon. So study 1, we looked to do this using a mindfulness induction. So we had a couple of hundred undergraduate students from the University of Holland, and they were randomly allocated to 3 conditions: mindfulness manipulation, excuse me, relaxation to control for the relaxation effects of mindfulness, and a filler task to control for the fact that when you're engaging in a mindfulness task, you're kind of doing something with your attention, not doing nothing. And we measured approach and avoidance coping using a brief version of the COPE inventory, and we also measured perceived stress to test this moderation question. So we didn't find main effects of mindfulness on either approach or avoidance coping, but we did find an interesting interaction effect. So as you can see here, there's generally a positive relationship between stress and avoidance coping on the y-axis. The more stressed you are, the more likely you are to want to get away from the situation. That's kind of intuitive. What we found, though, for those in the mindfulness condition, this effect was attenuated somewhat. There was a significant difference between the mindfulness condition and the relaxation, which is the dashed top line, as a function of perceived stress over the past month. So this is kind of the first evidence that, at least I'm aware of, for this basic idea that mindfulness its effects on coping may be contingent upon how stressed the person is feeling, and have differentially more significant effects as people feel more stressed. So study 2, we sought to replicate and extend study 1 using a slightly different, reasonably different method, where we had a multi-week mindfulness intervention adapted from MBSR. We wanted to see, again, whether this enhanced how people cope with significant monthly stresses, and again, whether this moderation question kind of, we wanted to test that. So we had 3 conditions. Participants were randomly allocated to an MBSR adapted condition, which was a shortened version of the standard MBSR protocol, a waitlist condition, and as a kind of a secondary question, we were interested in whether combining mindfulness with values, as in ACT, had differential effects on how people cope relative to kind of pure mindfulness, which is MBSR. This was kind of the secondary question to my thesis, but it's something we explored in this study. As I say, these were relatively short interventions, 3 by 3 hour sessions over a 6-week period. We measured coping, approach and avoidance using a COPE inventory pre and post, perceived stress to test this moderation question, and a bunch of baseline covariates as well. This is the basic model that we use to do the analysis. It's using our SE and SEM approach. We tested a number of different measurement models, and this one seemed to fit the data best, where coping is measured in a hierarchical fashion with 3 lower order factors and 1 higher order factor for each approach and avoidance coping. Essentially, the question we're asking is, was there a significant difference on coping, approach and avoidance at time 2 between the MBSR, for example, and the waitlist controlling for coping at time 1? And then the same basic question for the ACT versus waitlist. Here are the main effects from this study on approach coping. You can see both interventions were associated with significant differences relative to the waitlist control at time 2 on approach coping, controlling for coping at time 1. And on avoidance coping, we found significant differences for the MBSR condition in terms of attenuating avoidance behaviours, but not for the ACT condition, although that was kind of heading in the same direction, and be happy to kind of talk about why I think that might be the case if there's time at the end. But I guess the headline message from this is that the MBSR intervention seemed to enhance approach and undermine avoidance behaviours in relation to significant monthly stresses that people were asked about. In terms of the potential moderation effects in this study, so as you can see here, there's a positive relationship between perceived stress and avoidance coping if you're in the waitlist condition, which is the positive dotted line there. But that wasn't the case if you were in either of the other two conditions. And in fact, we found a significant interaction effect for the MBSR condition as a function of event-related perceived stress relative to the waitlist condition in this study. So that's the solid negatively sloped line relative to the waitlist condition. The ACT condition, there wasn't a significant difference, but it was, again, heading in that direction. So this is further evidence for this basic idea that it's potentially only above a certain kind of level of stress, or as stress increases between individuals, does mindfulness start to have a bigger impact on how people are coping. We didn't find a significant interaction effect in relation to approach coping in this study. So just checking back in with the main research questions, I'm now going to shift over to question 3, looking at particular components of mindfulness and kind of drilling in a little bit more to what's happening when people are kind of practicing. So studies 3 and 4 focused on this. And the way we did this was we took the ACT model, the psychological flexibility framework of ACT, which identifies 4 different components of mindfulness. And we chose this because these are relatively clear behavioural definitions of mindfulness behaviours and components. Based on a literature review, we focused on identified acceptance and cognitive diffusion as particularly likely to enhance coping responses relative to other mindfulness, the other mindfulness subcomponents. Acceptance, just for the sake of clarity, acceptance describes not seeking to change the formal frequency of our experience in the present moment. I think is quite intuitive. Cognitive diffusion is maybe a little bit trickier. It essentially describes distancing from thoughts. So you can see them as kind of mental events and less as literal truths that are kind of guiding your behaviour. It's a bit like perspective taking, kind of stepping back and seeing your thoughts just as thoughts. So in study 3, we sought to manipulate these two phenomena and compare them with some control conditions using a couple of hundred undergraduate students. And we did this in a laboratory setting. So we sought to manipulate stress, and to do this we gave students a social comparison experience where they did a test of their cognitive abilities, and we actually kind of manipulated down their score on this test. And so they were told that they were significantly below the student average on this test, which of course we know that students don't like, pride themselves on being clever. And then they came into the lab, where they were being randomly allocated to these 4 conditions, so acceptance and diffusion, the 2 mindfulness manipulations. Self-affirmation was included as a kind of a treatment as usual. There's plenty of evidence that manipulations of the self in the context of a threatening experience in another domain kind of reduces defensiveness and avoidance behaviour. So we thought this would be an interesting comparison versus mindfulness, which is not about kind of enhancing a sense of self or using other kind of cognitions to enhance a sense of self, but rather changing the relationship with have to experience. So that was kind of why we included that, and then relaxation control as well. And the way we measured coping in this study was behaviourally. It was trying to get away from self-report in this study. So avoidance coping we measured as simply the number of people that cheated, or that reported, I should add, that we asked them, having done this test, we asked them to report their scores to their peers and talk about where they could improve and where they went wrong, and we just measured the proportion of people that actually inflated their scores back up again to be seen to be clever as a way of avoiding that kind of social shame experience. And then approach was the degree of willingness to undertake a remedial tutorial to try and seek to improve their performance and kind of remove this potential source of stress. And then we measured perceived stress as well to test this moderation question that's a theme of the thesis. In terms of the main effects on approach coping, we found that acceptance seemed to have a significantly bigger effect on people's willingness to engage in remediation relative to the other conditions. Which is interesting. In diffusion, self-affirmation didn't seem to be doing as much relative to the relaxation condition on this measure. And the same story with avoidance coping. There's almost twice as many people in the self-affirmation and the relaxation conditions kind of inflated their scores when they were asked to disclose them relative to the acceptance condition. I'm happy to talk about why I think that is later on if there's time. And again, we tested this moderation question. So the general positive relationship between perceived stress and avoidance coping, that's what the literature says, but we found that for those in the acceptance condition, this was significantly attenuated. In this study, we also found a significant moderation effect on approach coping, which was, I guess, the first evidence that we had so far for the same basic effect, but in relation to approach coping rather than avoidance coping. Again, for those in the acceptance condition, that negative relationship between stress and approach was attenuated, it seemed, but only for those in the acceptance. So it suggests that acceptance is really doing something to how people's willingness to kind of be in the presence of stress and then engage in maybe a broader range of ways than you otherwise might expect. So in study 4, we kind of took a slightly different tack. Up until now, we were looking at relatively acute stresses, like your most stressful event of the last month, or that social comparison task. In this study, we looked at daily stresses and whether these two mindfulness components, acceptance and diffusion, predicted better coping with everyday stresses that's showing up in our lives. So for this study, we took a subset of the sample from study 2, controlled for a number of things from study 2, that were a part of the data collection process. But we collected these daily data over a 20-day period and essentially just asked people to think of their most stressful event of the day and then a bunch of questions about how they responded to that event. So essentially, all the measures were single item measures due to kind of space constraints. And we measured approach and avoidance coping, diffusion, acceptance. We measured how much control they had over the stressor, and I'll explain why that was important in a moment. We also measured stress-related appraisals. And there's evidence from the coping literature that the kinds of appraisals that people have in relation to stressful events predict how they respond to those events. Greater levels of threat, for example, and greater levels of self-efficacy. And we wanted to see whether the effects of our mindfulness measures influenced coping independent of stress-related appraisals to see whether mindfulness accounted for unique variance in coping relative to appraisals. And we analysed these data at the within subjects level, both within the same day, so stressful event today and your responses to that event today, and also across days, so it's a lagged approach. So very briefly, in terms of the effects within the same day on avoidance coping, we found that both diffusion and acceptance negatively predicted avoidance coping as kind of consistent with our previous findings, controlling for the effects of appraisals and a bunch of other things as On approach coping, we found that only for diffusion predicted significantly more approach coping, but we included a moderator in these analyses, which was stress or control. And there's evidence from the coping literature that in situations where people have a high level of control, they're much more likely to engage in approach coping, whereas in situations where you have relatively low control, big glass wall between you and the fire, there's not much point trying to put it out, that kind of stuff. And so this is an important moderator or contextual effect to include in relation to daily stressors. And so we found a significant but pretty small effect for diffusion, but not for acceptance. Then the lagged analyses was simply the question, does how mindful you were yesterday predict how you're coping today? Controlling for the autoregressive effects of coping and also your threat and self-efficacy appraisals on the previous day. And I won't show you the results for that, but they're essentially the same as the previous stuff I've just shown. Diffusion consistently predicted more approach and less avoidance coping, whereas acceptance didn't. And that's kind of interesting in itself, and I'll happily kind of try and account for why I think that is, some issues with that. But just to summarise the effects across the studies now, just to kind of bring this to a close, you can see small to medium-sized effects reasonably consistently across studies on avoidance coping. And particularly draw your attention to the experimental interaction effect, suggesting reasonably consistent evidence for this interaction effect, perceived stress. And then in terms of approach coping, it was more patchy. One sort of medium to large effect and a bunch of non-significant effects. And I think the basic reason for that is because, maybe I'll leave that for happily try and explain why I think that is. But essentially I think the basic conclusions were that mindfulness appears to particularly lower avoidance coping. And there's previous evidence to suggest this from other studies that have found more consistent effect on avoidance than on approach coping. I'll say, I think it's basically because the very behaviour of mindfulness involves non-avoidance. And in the context of stress, if you take a person into a stressful situation and they're being mindful, then they're not avoiding the stress that's in that situation. Whereas approach, I think, is a slightly more distal behaviour. It involves kind of planning or thinking of what I can do and taking more active steps. So I think that potentially explains the kind of the differential results there. Clear evidence that perceived stress seems to moderate the effects of mindfulness upon coping, which is a kind of novel finding. And then in terms of acceptance and diffusion, the last point there, we found evidence that both predicted coping, but these kind of effects were reasonably inconsistent, and I think more work is needed to unpack why that might be the case. And so very briefly, in terms of some implications, in terms of theory, I think this work reinforces theories of mindfulness that emphasise its role in helping people to regulate their behaviour rather than just enhancing their affect. And more broadly, I think this work is consistent with third wave behaviour therapies that emphasise changing the context or the relationship that people have with difficult thoughts and feelings as much or more than changing the content of such thoughts and feelings. And very briefly, in terms of some practical implications of this work, it suggests that mindfulness interventions may be particularly useful in high-stress work contexts like defence or other, frontline service delivery that are the most stressful positions or roles. And more broadly, mindfulness interventions may be useful in reducing avoidant behaviours, things like conflict avoidance or blame shifting in the workplace to avoid potential confrontation or extended periods of leave and so on. In terms of the kind of outcome of this work, a number of papers in preparation under review from the Thesis, listed there. And to finish with, I just want to acknowledge my wonderful supervisory panel, Rich, incredibly generous with his time, and Paul, who's basically been there from the beginning shaping this work, and David for his help over the last few months. I just want to acknowledge that. And also I want to thank Phil and Jesse for their help with the stats. So that's me.
Questions, comments?
Happy to flip back through slides as well.
So, in the intervention where you have people doing the social comparison, and not social comparison, but they got graded or whatever it was, they had a performance in class, and then they had to admit it to the class. You talked about cheating as an avoidance coping, but cheating was really misreporting what you did. And so what interests me about that, and I just think you might elaborate it here, has to do with how that relates to the acceptance manipulation, because that was the one that had the biggest effect on that. So tell us about the acceptance induction, and then why it is that that led people to be more honest, which is the way I would think about it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the acceptance, the emphasis was, it was adapted from Kristen Neff protocol, which is focused on self-acceptance and self-kindness. Bringing to mind a stressful situation, noticing where that stress shows up in the body, and then bringing a kind of an awareness to that and an acceptance, and knowing that we all experience similar situations all the time and so on. So, in a way, emphasising connecting with experience of stress directly, but why that influenced the tendency to want to avoid social comparison. The way I've thought about it is that it's a greater willingness to be in the presence of such emotions, such kind of uncomfortable emotions, and just a connection with that, which generally we tend to want to get away from straight away and not even acknowledge, let alone accept. That's how I've thought about it. Yeah.
Because there was a public component to this. It's not just the private acceptance of it, it's a public disclosure of your incompetence, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I was wondering maybe if you could link that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's how I've thought about it, that in the context of having to disclose, you publicly disclose your poor performance, that a whole bunch of thoughts are going to show up and feelings, and you inherently want to get away from that and not come into contact with those feelings and thoughts. And I guess the manipulation was directly bringing people into contact with those thoughts and those feelings. And in fact, they were asked to think about the fact that they wouldn't have to do this, in a few minutes' time. And so that kind of exposure piece, I think, is how I feel about it.
I can't remember if you included the common humanity bit in that interview.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. Yeah. So this sense in which, we all, I guess that's a good point. Yeah. So the sense in which we all experience these kinds of situations, and that they were all kind of in the same. But they didn't all know that they'd all had their scores reduced, by the way. But that could have been a part of it, an important part of it.
Hi, thank you so much. We actually work in equity pathways, and we work with a lot of schools in low socioeconomic areas, so a lot of students who have very stressful situations due to life complexities. And I'm wondering, have these kind of mindfulness studies been sort of trialled or involving high school students or even primary school students, or do you think there are ways forward with that to avoid those avoidance mechanisms that rather deal with the stress and
It's not really my kind of area of focus in terms of research. I looked at adults. I'm sort of vaguely aware, and others in the room probably more aware than me of a whole bunch of work that's been done in this area. Definitely exploring the effects of mindfulness in the school context. Definitely.
Just continue with that, Nicola was saying that, I'm from Equity Pathways as well, but it just reminded me a little bit of the work of Carol Dweck in Mindset. And when those students were coming in with the fixed mindset, and they find that particularly with gifted and talented students, that they are not risk takers because they want to keep their sense of worth, and whether that has some effect to the study that you were doing. but there was something about the fixed mindset and that ability to learn.
Yeah, we didn't measure mindsets in this work, but I think it's very much related. This basic idea that you've got a fixed sense of self that you want to defend versus a more malleable kind of sense of self that can change.
Yeah, just sort of practical questions. One of mine was like Richard's. Thank you for clarifying what the acceptance condition was. And did you also measure acceptance? And if so, how?
We didn't, not post. We measured trait acceptance,
Meaning
but not post the experiment.
Self-compassion scale, or what did you use?
Yes, exactly. We used the self-compassion scale at baseline, but not. We didn't measure that. We didn't include that in an outcome measurable. We included it as a covariant. Yeah.
Did it interact in any way? In other words, you would think that higher self-compassion would be people who would produce such results if it's a trait.
Yeah. Don't think we tested that. Yeah, that's interesting though. Interesting question.
Can I ask you a tough question?
I've been waiting for this.
It's a beautiful body of work, and really some fascinating, results from lovely way of thinking about what are the big questions. Whenever anyone does a piece of research, there are things they wish they'd done at the end. Are there such things in your case?
I was expecting much tougher.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's always issues with measures. That's probably the main thing, just measures, and just certain measures that we perhaps would have rather included, and there's always issues with consistency across studies and things like that. So probably the design side of things. Yeah, nothing particularly springs to mind. Sorry. Yeah.
Did you have anything in mind, Felicia?
That'd be interesting to hear a little bit more specificity about that. I mean, what
We also haven't really. Yeah, I mean, I guess just. I'd have to think about it, to be honest. Yeah.
One thing that happened, sorry, Joe, with the diffusion technique didn't work so well in that particular classroom setting.
A couple of sort of issues around that. Yeah, so that was one thing. The diffusion. We think that the diffusion. If you go back to this study here, like why isn't the diffusion really doing anything? We think we know why that is. There are significant differences between the diffusion and the other three conditions on distraction during the manipulation, suggesting that people were kind of not really engaging with it as much as the other conditions. And so there's something going on there with the manipulation, and it's something to kind of explore further, I think.
So what is the diffusion condition?
So it was essentially just asking people to notice their thoughts and imagine with each thought, as they experienced each thought, to practice kind of getting some distance between themselves and the thought by placing it on a leaf and watching it go down a stream, like a visualization exercise where you're imagining you're watching a stream, and each time a thought comes into your mind, you're putting it on a leaf and watching it float down a stream. It's from act literature. And we just think that it was kind of, people thought it was really weird, potentially, even though we tried to explain its purpose and so on. But to university students, 19-year-olds, it's like, what? Yeah.
That was my question.
Okay.
James, I'm interested with the three-arm intervention. We've got the weightless control and the mindfulness one, which is central to your thesis. And the position of the act arm is a complicated one in the storyline because it kind of doesn't do anything. Because the act is supposed to be the mindfulness plus. So I'm wondering how you're going to position that, and I've read a little bit, and I'm wondering, because in some ways it's almost, I'm not sure what to do with it.
Yeah. a fair question. It's something I've kind of thought about as well. Thought about, you know, basically, and obviously we've got a paper that's, you know, treats it in quite a different way, you know, in the context of a paper, but in terms of the thesis, thought about maybe potentially not including it, but I did include it because, I mean, we collected the data, and I guess it's just an interesting question whether mindfulness by itself enhances how people cope with stress versus, you know, the effect of values and values clarification exercises, which is in ACT.
Can you show the outcome?
Oh yeah, sure. That was on approach coping, so both interventions seem to enhance approach coping, but only the MBSR seemed to reduce avoidance coping. And I think the way I've thought about this is that, you know, the MBSR intervention really focused on connecting with pleasant and unpleasant experiences, you know, including stressful experiences. Whereas in the ACT intervention there was some focus on that, but more like connecting with values and focusing on what your values are and focusing on what behaviours you can take that are going to be consistent with those. And so I think that that's why we found significant effects on approach for the ACTs, but maybe not for the avoidance, because there was a bit less emphasis on that in the ACT intervention. So I mean, essentially, I think about this as a different way of manipulating mind. It's a different kind of mindfulness intervention, and it's, you know, it's increasing, I guess, use of ACT interventions and manipulation. So I think it's interesting to include it there. But yeah, I think it's a question.
Could you argue that this is evidence that adding values to mindfulness doesn't buy you much?
Yeah, I think so. In the context of coping, I think that's the important caveat. Like, that in the context of coping with stress, it doesn't seem to make much difference, because it's really my sort of interpretation is that coping is really about exposure and your willingness to be exposed to difficult stuff, and mindfulness is targeting that more consistently, I think, than focusing on mindfulness and values.
So that's a long bow to draw, really, because I think the way that ACT does mindfulness is very different to the way that, or at least knowing these two interventions, I would say that was the ACT one was mindfulness light. So what you might be looking at in that slide is that's the effect of values for the ACT one, and that's the effect of meditation for the MBSR one. But James's thesis doesn't in any way hang on even including ACT in that. I mean, you could easily have just not presented that.
Yeah.
It was primarily there as part of a cooperative exercise.
We talked about going either way. I just thought we thought we'd include it just because it's interesting. At this point, we could easily take it out. So Chris was going to...
I think I have an easy question, right? Can you put up the slide that has the stress on the bottom and then it said the interaction effect?
There are a couple, but was it this one?
It probably doesn't actually matter any of them.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm sort of reading this correctly. So you've got event-related stress on the x-axis, and you've got avoidance coping.
Yeah.
So these are, okay, so it's not actually showing that MBSR there's, as stress goes up, there's less avoidance coping. It's not showing that, it's standardized, so it's in comparison to other people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I did check that because I was like, gee, now hang on, the implications of that are a bit weird.
Yeah.
The more stressed you are, you're actually engaging in less. And
which doesn't make sense.
No, it was the interaction that was significant.
Yeah, okay, well, that makes sense. Okay.
James, if you had the opportunity to take this work forward in any way that you like, what might you do?
I think, I think exploring the particular mindfulness processes in more kind of depth would be interesting as well, because we found some kind of inconsistencies, like I said, with the manipulations and some of the measures. So I think trying to kind of develop that literature further would be interesting. Also looking at potential mediators of these effects as well. I mean, that was, I guess, kind of the Rich's question, which we didn't really do. We were just looking at, if you wiggle this, what happens to this? But how does that happen? And there's a fair bit of theory about what's going on and why this should be occurring, but I didn't really kind of look at that in this work. So I guess those are two ways, but you're asking good questions. It's definitely worth thinking about. I guess when you're focused on the immediate work, you don't think too much ahead, but I think those are two obvious areas to look further into. And I think also contextual effects as well, like in what kind of situations does mindfulness make a difference?
Any more questions?
One more. You kind of explained away the absence of an effect for cognitive diffusion as people weren't paying attention or they didn't engage the task. But I want to suggest another possibility, which is that very manipulation is avoidance. In other words, the very notion of distancing is you're pushing something away from yourself. And that seems equally plausible to they weren't paying attention. So I'm just wondering, is they weren't paying attention an easy out on that? Or is it, because it seems like a less critical way of dealing with that phenomenon?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, the reason I use this manipulation is because it's been used before, and it's been shown to kind of enhance the way enhance people's behavioural effectiveness in other contexts.
I just always want to put a caveat on that. So people use that manipulation for two reasons. One is to show the impermanence of thoughts as they rise by. So thoughts go by, they don't have to hang with us, we don't have to act on them because they often change, and this is particularly true of feelings. But this seemed more like, put this stuff on a leaf and let it get away from you. And that feels like a very different notion to me. So
it's interesting, yeah. I mean, the instruction was to watch the thoughts, go down, float down the stream. So it wasn't like there was an element of connection and not kind of pushing them away. But yeah, I think it's yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
Did you use the word distancing?
No.
Okay.
No. It was placing a thought and noticing, and there was a lot of acceptance as well in this, like not worrying about how many thoughts you have, not worrying if you have to place a whole kind of chunk of things on a leaf, and not worrying how many there are, and not worrying whether they're thoughts about how stupid or weird this exercise is. And so we tried to kind of make it an exercise that was very flexible in the kinds of experiences that people were having. And in that sense, I think that would inhibit the sense that it was kind of about pushing them away. It was almost about the opposite, kind of embracing them. But I still think it's an interesting thing, especially because these were 19-year-old people who had never done it before. So, yeah, it's interesting.
I feel that, did you know that they haven't done it before? Because mindfulness is quite a big thing in schools now. So I was wondering whether...
Yeah, it's possible that some of them have done it before.
Mindfulness strategies are used in schools for stress management.
It is possible that some of them have done it before.
Okay, I think it's about it, right? May I ask the panel members to stay here? Thank you very much for the